Excited to welcome three distinguished authors. We have Michael Hubbard MacKay. Not sure if you ever use your middle name, but it's on the sheet here. So
I usually just go by Mike.
Mike MacKay, Gerrit J. Dirkmaat, and Anthony. I don't know if you have a middle initials. Sweat.
Sweat's good. Just go with perspiration.
Oh yeah, he's a seminary teacher.
And their new book, which has just been released, From Darkness Unto Light, Joseph Smith's translation and the publication of the Book of Mormon, which is this here. If you may have seen, they brought some props with them here that are up on the front counter. Feel free to come and take a look at those, and they'll talk about them during their presentation. But just as by word of introduction, Mike MacKay received an engineering degree from the U.S. Air Force and a Master of Arts degree from the University of York in England. His doctorate of philosophy degree was also awarded by the University of York. He is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Church History and Doctrine at Brigham Young University. Gerrit Dirkmaat received his PhD in history in 2010 from the University of Colorado. He worked as a historian and writer for the Joseph Smith Papers Project from 2010 to 2014. He is now an assistant professor of church history and doctrine at BYU, but continues to work as a volunteer historian and writer on the Joseph Smith Papers Project. Mike MacKay was also an editor, I didn't write that down, of one of the volumes of the Joseph Smith Papers. And then we have Anthony Sweat, who received a bachelor's in fine art at the University of Utah, and then a master's and PhD in education at Utah State University. Mike MacKay was, like I mentioned, was one of the editors of the Documents, Volume 1 of Joseph Smith Papers, along with Gerrit Dirkmaat, and Gerrit is also one of the editors of Volume 3. Those are here tonight if you'd like. And then, unfortunately, I only have one book of Tony's, Tony, right? Yeah. Which is Mormon's, an open book, what you really want to know. But he also is the author of several others. Why, Powerful Answers to Practical Reasons for Living LDS Standards, and How, Essential Skills for Living the Gospel, as well as I'm Not Perfect, Can I Still Go to Heaven? All of those published by Deseret Book. So if you'd like any of those, we'd be happy to order them in for you. But we're excited for them to be here tonight. We're going to let them go ahead. Mike is going to speak first, and then followed by Gerrit, and then Tony, and then we'll have time for question and answers following that. Any questions, or I guess I got to go back to Kurt here and ask, any of you here for the first time tonight? I raise a hand. At least a couple. Well, great. Well, we welcome you here today. We do this on a fairly regular basis. We don't have anything else set up right now because we have the Mormon History Association Conference coming up the first weekend in June, which we would invite you to check out if that would be of interest to you. And then we anticipate having several other events like this throughout the summer. So if you aren't already on our mailing list, please sign up before you go so we can keep you in touch about this sort of event and other things that we do here in the store. Any questions? Okay, we'll turn the time over to Mike.
I guess, first of all, we want to thank everybody for coming, but we also want to thank Benchmark for advertising our book. We're really excited. We hope people like it, and hopefully this will give you a taste of what's in the book. And we spent a ton of time trying to turn it into a narrative and make this a book that people will want to read. So when you engage it, hopefully you can see the story develop of the translation and the publication of the Book of Mormon. But and then in addition, Tony has been just awesome to have. Tony not only knows the story as well as us, but he also is an amazing artist and has been willing to put together artwork that I think is a pretty problematic thing, or has been, And he's going to talk to us third. So it'll be me, Gerrit, and then so we'll start with the translation, go to the publication, and then do the artwork at the end. And so I'm gonna. This is actually a longer.
Is it working?
No.
Oh, click that. Is that working?
Mm-mm. Should I just click it?
Oh, no.
Okay.
It was working. We just tried it.
Well, your computer's not even going, is it?
Oh.
Yeah. It looks like the stone doesn't work. So maybe as he introduces it, let me just kind of tell you what Gerrit and I, we've spent probably 5 or 6 years arguing about the translation. And I mean that literally. We've been arguing about it, what exactly happened. And what we came down to is there are certainly ways that we can portray or we can speculate and find what exactly happened within the translation. There's been a lot of literature that actually has, and pun intended, the translation is an old hat. We're not revealing a lot. We found 2 new sources that have been very helpful to us. But
There you go.
there it goes. And so with the translation, our intentions with this was to line up and ask ourselves, for example, what did Emma say, and did it apply to the full translation, or did it apply to just the small period where she was participating? And additionally, Martin Harris and Oliver Cowdery. So when it comes to sources, we addressed every source that's out there. And in the end, we ended up favoring specific sources. Now, this sounds kind of strange, but the ones that we favored were those who witnessed it and what they believed happened during the translation. And so this book is not necessarily a statement about how the translation occurred. But it is a statement about those who witnessed the translation, what was their individual experience with the translation. And so we want each of their voices to be heard individually rather than wrapped up into a theory of what the translation of the Book of Mormon consisted of. And so you would think this is a very basic first step that would have happened a long time ago. Now, unfortunately, it hasn't. The theory has been driving the direction of where to go with this. And in the end, I think there's been a lot of good work done, but our contribution is fairly different. This is originally what drove us, this concept of translation and it emerging into the Mormon population. And Tony will address this with the images, but why is it that all of us, the traditional Mormon narrative and image of the translation is just so incorrect? And so what exactly happened with the translation is something that, to a scholar, I think a scholar in Mormonism, once again, it's an old hat, pun intended. So in some ways, when we wrote the book, we wanted to speak to Mormons in general and inform them of something that has already been out there and add to it in particular ways. In this case, I always show this when I'm discussing it. This is a beautiful image that is by a local Mormon artist. And you can see sort of the passion that goes into this. We're talking about the miraculous. Like, how do you uncover the miraculous? And when you uncover the miraculous, do you pin it down and pick it apart to a point where it's no longer miraculous? And so the individuals, the actors in history, say Martin Harris, for example, he portrayed this process as a miracle. And so we can pin him down in his accounts and dissect it to a point where perhaps it's calculable, it's quantitated now, but also the miracle is lost. And so in some sense you're picking apart something that they put together very carefully. So the translation of the Book of Mormon, and I think this represents sort of that power behind it. And those authors or those accounts of those who believed in what Joseph Smith was doing are calling out saying, I want my miracle back. And so those who have analyzed generally have stripped from the historical record what people believed and called a miracle. So in an academic process, how does someone stop and say, how do you deal with someone who says, I saw God? Well, you can stop and say, no, you didn't. I've never seen God. I don't know anyone who's seen God. How could you see God? And it would be a very obvious thing to do. Or you can stop and think about it more phenomenologically. This individual had an experience that can't be reproduced, and as a historian, I want to uncover that very thing that they believed happened. Individually, idiosyncratically, and phenomenologically, I want to uncover that which they believed happened. And I think our book does this very well. So do we pin them down and poke them for all of the inaccuracies? No, we let these people speak. I think you could do this, for example, any Christian or non-Christian could look at the resurrection and say, the resurrection, that's something impossible. Science says this doesn't happen. So you can sit down and you can say the greatest miracle of the Christian religion is something that we should pick apart and disregard. And I think to some extent, as Mormons, even more than the anti-Mormons, we have done that to this very thing, to the translation of the Book of Mormon. We have demiracleized the resurrection per se. So we have demiracleized the translation of the Book of Mormon. We've turned it into a secular act in which Joseph Smith, who never knew another language well other than English, especially not at this point. And so as Mormons, we have done this to this process. And then if you're a non-believer, of course, you're going to poke at this, and you actually have the right to poke at it. It's something, if you're a non-believer, you probably should poke at. And so you would have expected that, but it's the believing side. So if I go to a Sunday school today and I say, Joseph Smith put his head in a hat and saw words come across the top of the hat, a seer stone, and that's how the translation occurred. Well, that's a hard conversation to have in a traditional LDS church. So we have literally demiracleized something. I'm not talking about anti-Mormons. I'm talking about Orthodox Mormons. So do you see how that's the situation we're in? And part of reclaiming that was, once again, these answers to gospel questions. And I actually think they're doing this for the other topics. Polygamy, for example. Shall we turn polygamy into an act of sex, or shall we theologize polygamy and turn it into something that people actually believed in a theological manner? A similar thing, and I think that's what they've done in other instances. How much time have I got?
Probably 10 minutes.
Oh, I still have 10 minutes? Oh, okay. Well, let me just kind of go through a couple of the... in like 8, just give me a nod and
I'll
all.
throw something in.
So why have we misinterpreted it? This is a huge question because I think the brethren over the pulpit have not. This is a process. So you have Neil A. Maxwell in 97 who quotes David Whitmer, who is one of the most explicit as expressing the way that they believed that the translation happened. So David Whitmer in himself, which there was a time where his accounts were disregarded by Mormon historians of David Whitmer. And all of a sudden, Neil A. Maxwell says, David Whitmer explained that the translation happened like this. Roman words, or Roman letters would appear and glow forth and shine on this seer stone. He said that in conference. Yet, I as a Mormon can't go to a Sunday school class and express this, or even in my classes at BYU, I often have to stop and say, okay, I'm going to tell you something really hard. There was a miracle, and it was the translation, right? And so there is a bit of an irony here of where we're at with this kind of information in Mormonism. And with the internet, this information is blowing us over. And so how do you actually deal with it? Well, you go back and you responsibly and academically
tease apart what the accounts are and begin to try to understand what happened. And that's what our book does. Now, we favor the witnesses who said they saw what happened. Now, this is not an apologetic act. If you look at our footnotes, we also very carefully consider those who are not Mormons who heard what happened. But we favor those who say that they saw what happened. And objectively, it's almost unified from beginning to end. A couple of things you have to admit. Hat, seer stone in hat, Joseph head in hat. Now that story in itself eliminates any volition that Joseph Smith may have had. And it actually is a very supportive. This was an apologetic account back in Joseph Smith's day. Yet today it's an offensive act, or it's an offensive process in the sensibilities of Mormons today. So there's a bit of an irony there, right? And so something like a book like this will reclaim what exactly witnesses believed and said they thought happened, without theorizing. Now the theorizing should come. There should be somebody saying, well, what's cognitively going on in Joseph's head? Well, that's not our cup of tea. We're historians. We want the most conservative and specific account of what happened according to the actors and how they explained it to happen. And so that's kind of the essence of it. Okay, so Russell M. Nelson also did the same. The documents volume that Gerrit and I did, we also very explicitly gave this to the brethren who read it over and they saw what was happening and they were not shocked. It was literally an old hat to them. And so I think this is a pretty important point. So where are we at with it in this sense? So how much time?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. So I crossed out that image. So let me just go over it. With Joseph Smith, he revealed what many historians for years and years and years argued that Joseph Smith really didn't tell us. He actually thought that we shouldn't talk about what happened in the translation. The historical sources just don't play that out. Let me just give you a couple of examples. That Joseph Smith was revealing how the translation happened, but not in all circumstances. So one of the sources that we uncovered as a part of being in the church history library was the Palmyra Freeman. They have the only existing copy at this point. It was reproduced, but this was the original. And in that very copy, Jonathan Hadley, who Gerrit will talk about more, Jonathan Hadley went into that. He talked to Joseph, and Joseph told him exactly how the translation process happened. In fact, another printer even said he went through the process in front of him. Isn't that fascinating? And he certainly is exaggerating in that point. And he writes later, and it may have happened. He says it happened, I should say. So the original D&C 3, which is changed, this is not how it reads. It says, I had given thee sight and power to translate. He looked at it. This is the same phraseology Lehi uses when he's talking about the words that appear on the Liahona, like a scriptural account. Words appear on the Liahona, and he says, I looked, and I had sight, and I saw, and I read. These are all similar terms found in the Book of Mormon, but also the very first written revelation by Joseph Smith says right up front. How did the translation occur? His revelation says he saw it by sight and through the power of God. So this right here is very revealing, and the very first one. So to stop and say, what do we know? Joseph said a ton. Right there, compare that to the Book of Mormon, scripture that's coming forth at the exact same time. Very descriptive. So D&C 5 says he had a gift to translate. There's a whole bunch about gift that can go on there. He translated by the gift and power of God in the Three Witnesses statement. The preface said, I would inform you that I translated by the gift and power of God. which is very interesting. This is the 1831 Orange Conference. This is a conference where Joseph says, well, I don't want to say all of the particulars. And so historians of the past have said he never told anyone. Now, he's certainly making sense of what happened to him through these other accounts. Like, I would argue, if you were to theorize what happened in the translation, you might actually have to admit that Joseph Smith, in a miracle, he's describing a miracle that's happening to him. It still would have been up to his own perception, and he may never actually even known how it really happened. You see the problem of theorizing this to some extent? And so he's giving his experience, but in the 1834 minutes, there's an account that he did tell what happened with the translation of the Book of Mormon. So sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. Jonathan Hadley is a demonstration that he did right up front, right?
We'll give him all kinds of Hadley.
Yeah, Hadley. Hadley's this source that we found that is instrumental to what we've concluded. Also, through the Urim and Thummim. So I have like 3 minutes, right? So the concept of using a tool, a seer stone. So let me just explain this. In my classes where I have students who are baffled by this story, I'm guessing 80% of you have already heard the story, and some of this is a little bit old. But one of the things that has to be known, what are the earliest sources about Joseph Smith's use of an instrument? Well, the fact of the matter is there are parallels throughout the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon in itself, just like the Lehi experience, I saw words appear on a ball. There's also this Ammonihah. It's just like the book of Daniel, where there's these words that glow on the wall, like Belshazzar in the Old Testament. And the words glow forth, and the only person who can read them is Daniel the prophet, right? So here's another parallel, and that's in the Book of Mormon that parallels the Bible story of Daniel and Belshazzar. Additionally, the provenance, the Book of Mormon is very self-aware, and it's giving these descriptions of religious devices, how they function, and the process of passing them from one prophet to another. There are these 2 stones that are given to the brother of Gerrit, and those 2 stones are used to translate, or are intended to be used to translate the 24 gold plates that he writes. Mosiah II, he already has a seer stone. He's translated what he calls a rock. I mean, Mark Wright says it's a stela in South America. Well, I don't know about that, but anyway, he translates this stone, but then he translates the 24 gold plates. How? Using a seer stone. 2 seer stones were prepared. There's not a perfect provenance, but you get these 2 seer stones from the brother of Gerrit passed down, and it is insinuated in the Book of Mormon that those end up in Joseph Smith's hands as the Nephite interpreters. Joseph also has another seer stone. So the concept of an actual device being used, in the Book of Mormon, a device is generally used when there's translation. How those devices function, Helaman is told that the light shines forth in darkness, the title of our book. It shines forth in darkness. The words appear, just like the Belshazzar story. Or even you could go back to Moses. The words are burned into the stone by the finger of God. These kinds of metaphors and these kinds of descriptions of translation are extremely relevant to Joseph Smith's translation as evidence of how they believe things happened. How did it happen according to the witnesses? So I think I'll just leave it at that. That'll be a teaser to read the book.
Giving the whole farm away here.
I'm pretty sure I can yell loud enough that we don't even need this, but fast forward through what Mike might have said to you. Don't look at any of this. How many more did you have, Mike?
Yeah, I would get on the computer. There's like
really?
25 more.
Oh. You are right. There are dozens more. I may have to go in the old-fashioned way. And he takes 7. There we go. So obviously the book, part of what it does is presents all of the witness accounts of the translation to get a sense for what they were saying. But also part of what we want to do is talk about the efforts they went through to get the book published once they finally had it ready for publication. Some of the stories, very familiar to people, but a lot of this comes out of our research we had on Documents Volume 1, some of which research led to the redating of Doctrine and Covenants, Section 19 in the Doctrine and Covenants, as an understanding of what's going on in order to get the book funded for publication. Obviously, we all know they go to Egbert Grandin first, and I wish we had some kind of account from Grandin himself where he talked about what happened with their negotiations. Most of what we have to go off of is what other people say he said. But those in his family who talk about this most are pretty adamant that he just rejected the whole idea from the very beginning. He thought it was preposterous, and we get a little bit of insight into what he actually thinks about it when he publishes the title page of the Book of Mormon in the Wayne Sentinel, in the paper that he has. So that's in June. He publishes that. He says that it's pretended that this book is supposed to be published at some point. Probably at that point he's not the person agreeing to do it. Otherwise, he has very poor confidence in his own abilities, since he's saying he doesn't really think it's going to get published. Why isn't he going to publish it? There's a lot of commentary that goes around that, but essentially his family members say that he thought it was going to be an abysmal economic failure. And even with Martin Harris saying, "Oh, I'll pay for it," he, at least according to Palmer Tucker, is friends with Martin Harris and doesn't want to see him destroyed. He goes beyond just saying, "I'm not going to publish this," though. He actually tries to organize other prominent citizens in Palmyra, at least according to the sources, to prevent Martin Harris from publishing it, to try to convince him, what you're doing is ridiculous. You can't do this. And so, rebuffed by Grandin, the largest publisher in town, they go to another publisher in town, one that we often don't talk very much about. This is Jonathan Hadley. He's the publisher of the Palmyra Freeman. Hadley is a child prodigy in the printing industry, is the best way you could probably describe him. He's only 19 years old and already is the editor of this newspaper, and has been for a year and a half. Essentially, when he was 18, he became the editor of the Palmyra Freeman, which is this anti-Masonic newspaper. And, I have here, you can see, this is one of his ads, you can't really read it, but he's publishing in his paper, "I can publish anything, handbills, booklets, and I'll do it cheaper than anyone else around." You can see why this might be kind of attractive to these guys who try to find a way to publish it. They go to Hadley, and again, we don't know the context of that negotiation, only from bits and pieces. But the Hadley connection is really important to figuring out what they do next. Because without Hadley, it's almost impossible to explain why they decide to go to Rochester to find another publisher. I mean, Palmyra itself already has 2 printers who Joseph and Martin Harris thought at least capable of producing the Book of Mormon. Well, why aren't they going to Canandaigua or Lyons or these other towns that are much closer than Rochester? Why are they going right to Rochester? Well, Jonathan Hadley provides the connection. Hadley most likely said, I don't have the ability to produce a book like that. I publish a newspaper, and one that's not very widely read, which is the reason why we couldn't find any copies of it until 2007. But the paper itself is, it had a very small circulation. We'll talk a little bit about this, but Hadley is going to produce, following his discussions with Joseph Smith, the earliest account of the retrieval of the gold plates, the translation of the Book of Mormon, the story of the angelic visitations, by far the earliest that exists. And it'll be interesting. We'll cover it right at the end, but that's the teaser. That's like, you got to hang with me right till we get to the end, and we'll talk about it. We could talk a little bit about the fact that these are Masonic editors that are essentially in opposition to one another. The Wayne Sentinel is, I wouldn't say that it's pro-Masonic, it's not some tool of the Masonic movement, but it's certainly opposed to the anti-Mason movement that's burgeoning in New York. Whereas the Palmyra Freeman spends almost all of its time, Jonathan Hadley, every article is why Masons are the devil, essentially. I mean, just every article is just, Masons are evil, Masons are horrible. Well, where is he getting all that rhetoric? Why, you know, yeah, it's kind of lucrative because people are buying into that at the time. But it's from the master that he apprenticed under, which is Thurlow Weed. This is the connection between Rochester and Palmyra, is Jonathan Hadley. Jonathan Hadley likely said to Joseph Smith, I can't publish the book, I'm not set up to do it. But you know who can? The master I apprenticed under, Thurlow Weed, up in Rochester. Thurlow Weed is someone who has, again, published lots of things and has at least at times suggested that he even have the ability to publish books. Thurlow Weed is a pretty prominent American. For those of you who know your 19th century American political history, he is the founder of not only the anti-Masonic Party in New York, he becomes one of the founders of the Whig Party, and then again one of the founders of the Republican Party. And so he is the kingmaker that gets William Seward his power positions and nearly succeeds in getting William Seward the Republican nomination in the 1860 election, but falls short in favor of Lincoln. And so he's not quite that big a politician yet. He's served in the state legislature, but he's going to be. And that's important because he's a prominent politician for decades, which means he has multiple opportunities to comment on his connection with Joseph Smith and the publication of the Book of Mormon. Every time Weed writes about it, it's at a time of heightened anti-Mormon sentiment in the country. So there is a little bit of political gamesmanship that's going on around here. Of course, Weed's going to say that, you know, I have nothing to do with this book, but at the same time wanting that connection to give him a little bit of connection to the controversy. So the first account that we have is 1845 account. He calls Mormonism a delusion and a mental disease, which was often the referral to it. He explained to Joseph Smith and Martin Harris, Harris mortgaged his farm to raise the money required for the temporal support of the prophet and the printing of the Book of Mormon. The prophet and his convert came to Rochester and offered us the honor of being their printer. But as we were only in the newspaper line, we contented ourselves with reading a chapter of what seemed such wretched and incoherent stupidity that we wondered how Joe had contrived to make the first fool with it. So his very, very first account, he wants to get it across, hey, we didn't believe in that at all, just so you know. But he gives us his indication of why he didn't publish it. We're only in the newspaper line. As the story develops over time, Weed is going to progress his arguments for why he decides not to publish it. It's going to go from, well, we didn't publish books, and plus we thought it was stupid, to arguments that he couldn't do it because of humanity. He knew that the Book of Mormon was this falsehood that would be perpetrated. He didn't want to, in one case he says, he didn't want to beggar Martin Harris and his family by taking their money because, you know, this clearly wasn't going to sell. And in his last account that comes in his autobiography, he actually claims that to demonstrate the power of the translation, to demonstrate the miracle, that in his office Joseph actually pulled out a hat and pulled out a stone and placed it in the hat and began to translate right there in front of him in order to show the miraculous power. Weed, of course, says he wasn't impressed and that Smith left, but that he came back the next day with Martin Harris. Even that later account, I don't know whether or not that actually happened. By the time Weed is making that claim, multiple people have explained how the translation was done with the hat and the stone. Maybe he's just embellishing. Maybe not. He says it happened. I don't know that we can know. But even his account suggests the real reason why Weed is hesitant to publish the book. The fact that Joseph leaves and comes back again doesn't really suggest that Weed said, there's no possible way that I'll ever publish this because it's wrong in humanity's eyes. But Joseph comes back the next day with Martin Harris suggests what Weed's really concerned about is this book isn't going to sell at all. And I'm not going to put up the money for it. The way that printers worked back then is at least somewhat similar today. The printers bore the risk of books having to sell in order to make profit off of them. And now the 3 publishers they've gone to have all told them this book isn't going to sell at all. So they go back. They find Elihu Marshall, as many of you are aware, another Rochester printer. We have a biographical discussion of him. He's very interesting. He's a religious radical of his time, and has actually just barely published a tract in which he argues that people shouldn't be condemned for the peculiarity of their religious beliefs as long as they're good people. At least from other things Elihu Marshall has published, you could see why he may not have a moral problem with the idea of Joseph producing new scripture. We don't know anything about their negotiations except that they returned to Palmyra with Elihu Marshall's agreement in hand that he would publish it. Coming back to Grandin, obviously they don't want to have to board in Rochester to do this. They want to keep very tight control of the text. So they say, look, we're going to publish this no matter what. And Grandin finally acquiesces and says, okay, we'll publish it. This is where the conversation with D&C 19 comes in, and we discuss this in the book, that although Harris had promised, really since he had gone to Charles Anthon's account of their visit is that Harris told him he was going to sell his farm to pay for the printing of the Book of Mormon. Harris had been promising that he was going to sell his property to pay for it. But now on the tail end of having gone to 4 separate printers, who all essentially told them, this book is not going to sell at all, Harris likely went from thinking that the Book of Mormon was a financial investment, or at least something he wasn't going to lose money on, to the cold hard reality that professionals in the field were saying, no one's going to buy this. Not only are they not going to be interested in a 600-page book about some esoteric religious experience, it's going to be too expensive the way you're trying to produce it for anyone to be able to afford to buy it. And this crisis of conscience causes Harris to waver, even after Grandin's agreed to publish it. I mean, we talk about in the book the cost of publishing the Book of Mormon. We say it all the time, $3,000 for 5,000 copies, but $3,000 is, the average worker in America makes about $250 a year then. Or to put it in greater perspective, Joseph Smith's home and 14-acre farm, he would have to sell 15 times over to raise the funds to pay the Book of Mormon. So, and he doesn't own his farm, so he can't even do that. In fact, he's late on his payment. So the concept of needing Harris to pay for it is really there. And I think that speaks to, when you read Doctrine and Covenants section 19, to the urgency and really the condemnation that's coming from the Lord in that revelation to Joseph Smith. That you need to agree to do what you said you were going to do. Now, I told you we'd come back to this. Imagine you're Jonathan Hadley, and the last conversation you had with Joseph Smith and Martin Harris was you sending them up to have your political friend and ally publish this book. And the next thing you hear is your crosstown biggest rival is actually going to have all that money flowing into his coffers. Jonathan Hadley is irate when he finds out that the book is going to get published by the Wayne Sentinel Press inside of Palmyra. Oh, that's supposed to tell me shut up, I think. Let me just read a little bit of this here, and then I'll turn it over to Tony. The cool part about this now is that we knew the Palmyra Freeman existed. We knew that portions of it we had because other papers printed portions of what they said. But we didn't have the entirety of the article itself until that was found through some of the Joseph Smith papers researching an obscure library in Pennsylvania. The cool part about early anti-Mormon articles is how they don't need to try to stretch what they think the truth is. If you think about your own lives, if you were to walk out of this building right now and meet someone in the parking lot who said, I just saw an angel, your first response would not be to believe them. You really wouldn't need a whole description of what this guy does, what kind of meds he's on. Your first response would be, you're crazy and I'm going to get in my car. Right? I mean, because you don't see anything wider behind it. And here, Hadley believes, just telling the story the way he was told it, is so preposterous, no one could possibly believe it. And, let me get into my sarcastic 19th century editor role to read some of this. The greatest piece of superstition that's ever come within the sphere of our knowledge is one that has for some time past and still occupies the attention of a few superstitious and bigoted individuals of this quarter. It's generally known and spoken of as the Golden Bible. Its proselytes give the following account of it. In the fall of 1827, a person by the name of Joseph Smith of Manchester, Ontario County, reported that he'd been visited in a dream by the Spirit of the Almighty, and informed that in a certain hill in that town there was deposited this Golden Bible, containing an ancient record of divine nature and origin. After having been thrice thus visited, he states, he proceeded to the spot, and after penetrating Mother Earth a short distance, the Bible was found, together with a huge pair of spectacles. He had been directed, however, not to let any mortal being examine them under no less penalty than instant death. They were therefore nicely wrapped up and excluded from the vulgar gaze of poor wicked mortals. It is said that the leaves of the Bible were plates of gold, about 8 inches long, 6 wide, and 1/8 of an inch thick, on which were engraven characters or hieroglyphics. By placing the spectacles in a hat and looking into it, Smith could, he said so at least, he puts in parentheses, I don't actually believe this, he said so at least, interpret the characters. The crazy thing about this account is there is no other published account he can borrow from. This is the earliest account that exists. So whereas when you deal with, say, even Mormonism Unveiled and the accounts that are given there are multiple newspaper accounts that Eber Howe can borrow from by that point. Jonathan Hadley has no account he can borrow from. And yet, the information he's providing squares exactly with what other witness accounts are saying. That there were stones, they were placed into a hat, and that's how they were able to be translated, which means that this is even how Joseph and Martin Harris were explaining it when they were trying to get Jonathan Hadley to publish the book. This date, August 11th, 1829, this is before even the first page of the Book of Mormon is typeset. It's not even going to be till September that they're actually printing this thing. That's how early this is. And that's why it's such a key source. There's a lot of other fun things in there that we cover in the book, but one that's probably fun, at least for this group, to talk about. Remember, he hasn't seen the book, or at least we don't know how much of the manuscript he's examined. But he has met Joseph Smith, he knows Joseph Smith's family. And one of the things that he's most incredulous about, not that he says he saw an angel, folks, but also that he's claiming to have produced this book that's supposed to be superior to the Bible. Now, it appears not a little strange that there should have been deposited in this Western world, and in the secluded town of Manchester too, a record of this description. And still more so, that a person like this Smith, and then he puts in parentheses, very illiterate. That conversation about Joseph Smith being illiterate, farm boy, the first person who comments on it is the first person who says it. Very illiterate. Should have been gifted by inspiration to find and interpret it. It would be recorded as a new thing under the sun. It certainly is a new thing in the history of superstition, bigotry, inconsistency, and foolishness. It should be, and doubtless will be, treated with neglect it merits. The public should not be imposed upon by this work, pronounced as it is by its proselytes, to be superior in style and more advantageous to mankind than the Holy Bible. He then goes on to print the title page of the Book of Mormon, which by this time had already been published in the Wayne Sentinel, so he might just be borrowing that, or maybe he has a copy given them, we don't really know. But in either case, this is a source that's prominently featured here. Yes, for some members of the church, they might be, have a little bit of heartburn over the fact that he's an incredibly antagonistic source. But also, given the time frame in which he's speaking, he has no idea Mormonism is ever going to amount to anything. He doesn't know that there's going to be hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of proselytes. In fact, he thinks it's ridiculous on its face. He's just mad that all this money's flowing into his competitors' coffers. And so he doesn't think that anything's going to come of it. Now, years later, when people are writing things, they have to try to find other ways to explain the Book of Mormon, because Mormonism hasn't just fallen on its face. So this is something that's going to come out in several of the chapters of the book. I'm going to turn some time over to Tony so he can talk about the artwork. Oh yeah, no, I'll just got the mic back here.
It's hard to live up to that radio voice.
Yeah.
You should have heard my Missouri voice. I didn't even do that.
All right. How many slides do I need to skip here? Oh,
I
there
think
we
you
go.
shouldn't have to skip any.
All right. Nice job. All right. I'm so grateful to speak to you about this subject. I feel so honored to be even connected with Mike and Gerrit. I feel a little bit like the backup place kicker on the New England Patriots who gets a Super Bowl ring for not doing anything. That's kind of my role in this gig. I feel guilty even signing the book. I got to know Mike 2 years ago when both he and I were hired as new professors in church history and doctrine, and we were on a trip in Palmyra visiting church history sites. And Mike mentioned to me, we were talking translation stuff, and he was telling me basically about this project. And I loved it, and long story short, I drew out some little sketches of, I was like, Mike, you need some images. You need images with this book, because whether we like it or not, we all know the cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I said, let me do some images for you. And we were fortunate that we got some funding, and I was able to put together a few images for this book, which were fun. And then as we started speaking about it a little bit, I had also been doing some research. My background is in art. And I got a bachelor's degree in fine art. I've always been really interested in Mormon imagery, and I had been doing a little bit of research on imagery of the translation of the Book of Mormon. And Mike said, well, why don't you take some of that research and put it as an appendix essay in our book, and you can talk about your images you produced for the book and some of your research. So I just want to share a few thoughts on it. And I brought in, by the way, the original painting. This is the painting I did for Mike's book, Mike and Gerrit's book, and a few of the chapter heading images as well if you want to come take a look at it. All right, here's why it's important. We're all familiar. This is Harry Anderson, a great Seventh-day Adventist, a great artist, wonderful artist. He did some images for the church, and I remember being a little boy and seeing this image, and here's where the problem comes in. I saw this image, and take a look at it closely. What could one deduce about crucifixion from this image? And I invite your feedback on this. Yeah, and then there's no blood. What else could you deduce?
One's nailed in one's throat.
Yeah, this confused me as a kid. I remember seeing this as a kid. Did this ever confuse any of you? I remember seeing this and thinking, oh, Romans only nailed Jesus to the cross. They did not nail other persons. They did it specifically only to him. And I don't think that's supported historically whatsoever, but I came to that conclusion as a kid based off seeing some artwork. Now, I don't know why Harry Anderson chose to rope the two thieves and only nail the Savior on it, but he did so. Okay. Here's another one. If I grabbed 1,000 Mormons right now, and if I said, picture King Noah in your mind, 999 of them are going to picture a large fat man, even though the Book of Mormon text never once mentions King Noah's weight. Now they do call him a gluttonous winebibber, but they don't mention his weight whatsoever. And I've done this before. I even say to them, what pets does King Noah have? And they're like, leopards. I'm like, how many? They're like, 2. And they're petting them on both sides, you know. This is just very common. You say, picture Abinadi. 999 people will think he's an old man. An extremely ripped old man, by the way. An interesting experience. This is Del Parsons' classic, The Lord Jesus Christ. Probably the most reproduced image in Mormonism. I had an interesting experience. Prior to coming to BYU, I worked for the church educational system through seminaries and institutes. I was hosting a group of Saudi Arabian educators, and they came and they were looking at an LDS seminary, and they saw this image on the wall. There's about a dozen of them, and one of them looked at it and said, "Who is that?" And I said, "Oh, that's Jesus." And all 12 of them broke out in spontaneous laughter at the same time. Oh, they started laughing, and they're talking to each other. And I said, what's so funny? And they said, you think Jesus was an American mountain man? And I said, well, what do you think Jesus looked like? And what do you think they said? Like us. He looked like us. And it actually comes to an interesting concept. And it's that we use art
art, if I can get to the heart of my thesis that I write in this appendix chapter, art was never intended to reproduce historicity. Artists don't think historically, nor are artists historians, nor do they attempt to paint historically. That's not their medium, that's not their mode, that's not their goal. An artist's goal is to communicate ideas and thoughts, and often they use symbolism to do so. And they use what resonates. That's why Del Parson, as an American mountain man himself, paints Jesus as an American mountain man. That resonates with him. That's why Rembrandt, when he painted, he placed the Savior in quaint little 16th or 17th century Dutch settings. He wasn't even attempting to place him over in Jerusalem. And so when you ask people to picture the Book of Mormon translation, this is what they picture. And I've done this with students before. I've actually put up images of the translation of the Book of Mormon, and I've said which one of these most accurately represents, not these ones, but a variety of them. Have some with the sheet, and I'll throw one in there of Joseph looking in a hat. And I'll say, which one most accurately represents the translation of the Book of Mormon? I've asked this. I teach large section classes at BYU, so I get to teach thousands of students, so my sample size is extremely large. Therefore, these outcomes are very valid. I'd say which one? Roughly, 30% will say this. Almost 50% of them will pick this one. Now when I ask them what's wrong with this, the only thing that they say that's wrong with it is, what do you think?
The lamp. Yeah.
The lamp! No.
Well, no.
That's clearly from the 1870s. No. The main concern there was, did Oliver see the plates? That's what they want to know. They're like, wasn't there a sheet? That's all they care about. Only about 7% of my students ever select the hat. Therefore, back to Mike's question, I think with some statistical validity, we could say, take a common Latter-day Saint, a BYU sample anyway, which the majority of them are return missionaries. How many of them know that Joseph translated the Book of Mormon by placing cedar stones in a hat? I would say less than 10% understand that concept. The majority of it comes, though, because of imagery. And students will say, when we talk about it and we show them the sources and we look at some of the things that Mike and Gerrit have written on and that others have written on, they'll say, but that's not how it's represented in the imagery. I just want to show you, this is an actual email I got from a student after we talked about the translation. I just wanted to thank you for today's lesson about Joseph Smith and the translation process. A little over a year ago, I started spending a lot of time with my friend, and I omitted the name for confidentiality, who had recently left the church and was pretty much convinced of atheism. He had researched some things about Joseph Smith, which means he went on Wikipedia, and would tell me all about it. When he would tell me about those things, my first instinct was to deny it and to say, no, and then listen, this is the point. No, that can't be true. That's not what the illustrations of the translation look like. And I've never been taught that at church. But you're seeing how imagery actually affects people's views of history and their beliefs. Now the problem lies in that artists don't intend to teach history when they create an image. For part of the essay, I interviewed a handful of artists, including Del Parson, Walter Rain, if you know who Walter Rain is, he's one of the great artists in the church, and J. Kirk Richards, who's a great up-and-coming artist. And I asked them some questions about painting historically and painting realistically. And they just, I mean, look at what Walter Rain said right here. I don't think an artist has any responsibility to be historically accurate. If I am doing a painting, I can do whatever I want. I can look at a sunset and paint it blue instead of red if I want to express something. I don't feel like as an artist I have a responsibility to be historically accurate unless someone has commissioned me. And Walter Rain was he's been commissioned by the church for a number of things. And he has said, now if they commission me and say they want it a certain way, I'll do my best. He says, but if I'm just painting, I'm painting. Art is self-expression. Art is communication. That's what art is. If I'm trying to express something that's important to me, I'll do whatever I want. If it means putting Christ in contemporary clothing or whatever, if it's important to the message I'm trying to make, then I'll do it. And this is what Kirk Richards said. I've had lots of people talk to me about what the correct clothing of the first vision is. And hold on, before I even go on with this. Think of the imagery of Joseph in the first vision. Let me ask you this question. What clothing is he wearing?
White shirt.
A white shirt? Brown pants and a vest. Now, here's what's I could go through, and I'm doing some research on this right now. Nearly every painting of the first vision clothes Joseph exactly the same. That's an amazing phenomenon. And it actually moves to the symbolism of art. We have started to interpret Joseph, if we're going to do a first vision painting, he's wearing these clothes. I could almost start to move it and abstract it. And I could just paint brown pants, white shirt, vest, and a boy looking up, and we're going first vision. Because that's what art does to us. And look what Kirk Richards says. About people talking about what the correct clothing is of the first vision and so on and so forth. In reality, I don't care. Some clothing expert is cringing right now, you know. I want to feel what we feel when we think about the first vision. And a lot of times historical details detract from getting that feeling across. So very low on my list of considerations is historical detail. Sorry, historians. Don't hate me. I'm usually trying to represent the principle of a spiritual truth rather than a historical truth. Now that being said, and by the way, I will add this. There are some people who are critical of the church, whether valid or not, for their imagery of the translation of it. I think you'd be surprised to know, some people would anyway, when I interviewed Walter Rain, I asked him about the painting Joseph looking like this, looking into a hat. And Walter Rain actually said, the church has approached me on a few occasions to do that painting. And he said, but I could never get it to look right. And this is back to the language of art. Why do so many LDS artists choose to put Joseph at a table with plates open, with his finger in the plates, and him thinking pensively about it, and they don't paint hats and seer stones and faces in hat? Well, the unjuicy reality might be, instead of like some historical rewrite of Mormon history, the unjuicy reality might be that it just doesn't look right. It doesn't communicate visions and inspirations. All it communicates is stomach sickness. Because, to be totally honest with you, this is one of the chapter heading illustrations I did for Mike and Gerrit's book. What looks like is happening here? Yeah, I mean, I did this and my wife came and she was like, did Emma cook something bad for lunch? And I joked around, I called this one the sick of Joseph. Because it just doesn't, nothing about this might, and as Mike and Gerrit show, this was probably the method or what it looked like. But it doesn't communicate the right idea of revelation and inspiration and miracle. It just communicates stomach sickness. So it's an interesting phenomenon. Nevertheless, because I know how art influences things, when Mike and Gerrit did this book, I said, let me try to create an image for you. The painting up here, and the final painting that I did, here's a digital image of it. This was my best attempt to try to marry the two worlds of artistic device. So I used some artistic devices in here, and historical reality. So this is actually from a photograph I took in the Whitmer home, where Joseph finished the translation in the upper room. I painted it with a white top hat because Martin Harris calls it the old white hat, as Gerrit and Mike talk about in their book.
That hat doesn't look very old, though.
Well,
it looks like it just came out of the shop.
It might have.
He had recently bought a white suit, so it's not old.
And you want to know what? And see, this is back to artistic device. Now look at this. When you look at that painting, here's what I'll just teach you a little artistic trick. I did not use bright white anywhere in this entire painting except on the rim of that hat. Now why would I do that? It draws your attention. As an artist, I want to pull your attention to certain things. And I want to pull your attention here. And then I want to pull your attention here. And then I want to pull your attention here. And then I want to pull your attention here. And why would I paint? Mike actually, when I was doing the painting, I showed it to him. Mike said, basically, why do you have this lamp lit in the middle of the day? Historical reality? No. Artistic device? It says something about what I believe is an inspirational process that brought forth the Book of Mormon. So, I hope as you guys get the book and read Mike and Gerrit's excellent work, that maybe also you enjoy some of the imagery that tries to portray the translation as best as possible anyway, a little bit more historically accurate. Okay. Yes?
When are we going to get a picture of Christ with his beard chopped off?
Oh,
I hope soon.
Yeah,
I hope soon. Actually, he said, when are we going to get a picture of Christ with his beard chopped off?
I always thought that was to encourage BYU to let their professors have a beard.
Actually, Caravaggio, the great artist, did a beautiful painting of the Savior, beardless. I think it's one of the most beautiful images I've ever seen of him.
I saw one beardless with a crew cut.
Yeah. Yeah, Brian Kershiznik, who's a great modern LDS artist today, has a painting of Jesus beardless and with hair as short as mine, healing the blind man by rubbing dirt in his eyes. It's fun.
Let's go ahead and open up the questions. If whoever it is that has the microphone, if you just repeat the question for us.
Okay. Gary?
What can you tell us about the seer stones that the church has in its possession?
Less than some other people.
I'm specifically interested in how many does the First Presidency still have them, or have they been transferred over to the church library or the museum?
So Gary asked what. So the church possesses seer stones, and so where are they? They're I should say right up front, I don't know. But the place that they're supposed to be is the First Presidency's vault.
So in the course of your research on the topic, you didn't have a chance to examine them?
No, but I did ask.
Hey, Tom!
Yeah.
So the fact of the matter is, and perhaps it's still up in the air, the fact of the matter is so me and Mark, Ashurst, McGee, and Gerrit sat down and put together a proposal where we described it as a religious devotional object that would not only be part of Documents Volume 1, but it would be an important part of Documents Volume 1. And the response back is, well, the church protects sacred, private, and confidential, and before it went anywhere, it was very clear that this was a sacred item. So whatever you take from that, I took from it that it's a sacred item. So the concept of it. Now that being said, let me just say a couple more things about. So I've been researching. I've been trying to do the provenance of all of the stones, and it'll be a work that I publish later. But I tried to do a provenance of every Mormon seer stone. So where does it come back, and how do you draw it back? My conclusion in almost every circumstance is all of the provenance is bad. And so to prove and demonstrate where these stones come from and that they are the particular stone that we think has just come up with all X's. The problem is the brown stone, for example, which most historians think is Gazelem from the Book of Mormon in Alma 37:23. I cannot connect the provenance. The white stone, we can't even. Mark Ashurst McGee argues that it's the white stone that's the brown stone, and the brown stone's the white stone. I disagree. I don't think the evidence says that. So you're talking about dissonance here. And I think that's what we're going to have to live with when it comes to the seer stones. But I think, for me, I think it's the concept of Mormonism embracing religious objects is unbelievably tantalizing. The way that...
Yes. I missed the beginning, so I apologize if you already covered this. Do you cover the magic world view that seer stones were used in? Give some context about that.
Okay, so Joseph Smith's relationship. So Joseph Smith was a money digger, and authors in the past have taken several viewpoints on that. Now, because the money diggers used seer stones, the connection between money digging and the translation is a factor, right? So it's a factor. So in the past, you have individuals who have said it was a developmental process. Mark Ashurst McGee's dissertation is probably the most read and the most respected piece on that. And Richard Bushman believed that culturally, he grew through his money digging experience into something that God ordained later. And he argues that in Rough Stone Rolling. Now, this is an interesting point. Like, even Mark breaks this up and can't decide how one caused the other.
And so in the end, when you're looking at the influence between money digging and the translation, once again, you come up with you are in a speculative arena here. You can say, yes, it occurred, yes, there was a culture, and you can see commonalities. Now, to link those commonalities into a firm conclusion, as we've studied it and tried to hit every single source, tried to understand it, what you come out with is speculation. The book in itself is a serious attempt on our part to not speculate or draw synthetic conclusions, to let the sources draw the conclusions for us. And so money digging is a major problem for coming up with a conservative book that is extremely honest. And so if I come to the conclusion that it was a developmental process from money digging to the translation, I have to have evidence. There is not enough evidence to come to that conclusion. Additionally, even dating when he gets the seer stones, there are no contemporary accounts about that. The very best one is in our volume, Documents Volume 1, where you talk about a money-digging license that Joseph was a part of. And it's just shrouded with problems and provenance, and we are not positive. How do you use these sources responsibly? Not just coming to conclusions with them, but we want to be responsible. The conclusion is what the documents tell us. And so if we perpetuate ideas within these arenas that are unsupported, then you have there is a lot of that in the past. I think Mike Quinn's done unbelievable work here and drawn some very serious conclusions, and they're all cultural and drawing links through association rather than letting the documents speak specifically to the relationship. And so, I think I'm kind of rambling about this now.
You're kind of answering.
I want you to comment on that.
I think that, it's not, since the book was primarily focused on what the witnesses of the translation had to say, of course, none of the witnesses connected to treasure digging at all. And so, as Mike talked about, there is a great difficulty in determining what is a good source, and how can we get from point A to point B in the sources. Well, what do we know? Well, we know that none of the witnesses of the translation saw a connection there at all. And so, is that possible that that's what's going on? Well, yes. I think some of the things that Mike and I have talked about, whether or not it's reflected, or it's a little too speculative to be reflected in this book, is that there are multiple ways of trying to understand how that affects his entrance into becoming a seer. Now, and that's especially the case when we don't actually know when he got his first stone. There's a big difference if he got his first stone in 1818 or if he got it in 1822. Because whether or not he's had his first vision, or believes he's had his first vision, is a very big difference in how he perceives what stone he has and what power is coming from that.
So it's chicken and egg there. So are the money diggers interested in him because he is people know that he saw Moroni, or is he interested in the money diggers and then he has the Moroni experience? That right there is an undecipherable concept. So Mike Quinn uses this source by Dodd, it's given in 1887, and Dodd says he remembers it in 1818. Everybody have debated that source and come to the conclusion that you can't conclude with that source. So Mark Ashurst McGee has moved it up to 1822, which is a better argument as sources go, but even that is questionable, and he thinks it's most likely could be pushed to 1824. So now you're talking about money diggers are interested in Joseph because he claims he already has contact with a set of gold plates. So if that's the case, and you can see there's a very good argument there, but and it's for the concept of eliminating the money digger experience, it's still not good. It's still not very good. So we chose to stick with the experiential witnesses. Did they associate money digging with it? Well, they knew Joseph was a money digger, but they didn't. Oliver Cowdery certainly knew it. He said so, anyways, in 1834. Yet the association is bad. So, like, are we hiding anything here? No, we just don't think there's a conclusion that can be drawn that's as solidified as an eyewitness person who says, this is what happened, and Joseph told me that's what happened. Which the rest of the book consists of that kind of evidence.
You'll notice, too, that Jonathan Hadley did not make that argument. And someone from 1829, who is a resident of Palmyra and has been for several years, if that is what is being stated, as much as people try to say that it is stated, oh, everyone knew Joseph was a money digger, which is, of course, coming out of Philastus Hurlbut's affidavits in 1833 and 34, at least with someone who's very deliberately trying to defame Joseph Smith in 1829, he didn't take that easy route out. Why didn't he just say, everyone knows Joseph Smith is a treasure digger, and it is a tough sell, given that early document.
So it's the short answer.
Yeah. Like 10 minutes. The short answer ended 10 minutes ago.
This is like one of the funnest topics too. I mean, I suggest you dig into this because it's good. We're not trying to hide any of it, but the purpose of the book and the intentions of the book, it did fall outside of the scope. But I assure you, we have left no stone
Thought a lot about it.
Pun intended.
Yeah, exactly.
No stone out of the
Unintended.
hat. Yeah.
So yeah, you won't find a huge dialogue about money digging, but we are very well aware of it. Future writing will include it. But the purpose of this book is the scope is intended to address a certain question through a certain lens, and it does it very specifically.
Other questions?
So it's a co-publication with RSC and Deseret Book. Did you have much contact with the editing folks or whoever at Deseret Book? And how did that go? I mean, this is as nuts and bolts history as Deseret Book has ever printed.
Yeah, I mean, we hope it does well, so they start doing more.
Yeah, everyone buy a copy, then we'll put out more.
So the relationship, number one, RSC has taken a very positive turn in the recent past. The director, Tom Wayman, is a very academic individual, driven to increase the academic output of that press, which is a very positive thing for all of us. It's still determined, and it is a BYU press, but it's intended to improve. So his attempt now, the reason that we went with Deseret Book also is because we wanted to reach that readership. We would like scholars to take it serious, and I think if they read the book, they will.
Well, Richard Bushman takes it very seriously. That's why he did the foreword for it. So I mean, I think someone wanting to impugn the scholarship of it, they have to deal with the fact that Richard is the one saying in the foreword, this is a lot of scholarly work here.
And it went through a traditional double-blind peer review 3 times. Richard Bushman wrote the introduction. So it does have the rigor, and yet it was written for, because we do want to communicate to those 90% of people who have no idea about the translation.
After they get out of his class and they still don't know.
There's also, let me just make this point too. Like, we keep plugging the translation. There are at least 3 dozen brand new arguments and claims about this period in the book. One in particular is, we see no evidence in all of the documents that Martin Harris or Joseph Smith knew or had been informed that the plates were in Egyptian. There is 0 evidence. Now, what does that do to the story? Well, we've uncovered new letters from Charles Anthon. We've demonstrated that Charles Anthon was likely only interested because he was collecting Native American stories for a book. Now, this is a brand new argument, and it'll go under scrutiny, and we've researched it very carefully. But these are some major new discoveries that come out in the book. But we're hoping with we have this strange thing in Mormonism where everybody reads, and books in Mormonism sell well enough that Oxford Press will do this whole series, right? And publish, some 40 titles, which would never sell anywhere else. And so we're trying to tap into that market, but also open the minds of average Latter-day Saint readers into a world that if the church is worried about faith crisis, the very worst thing to do is not offer information. Not just apologetic information. In fact, I think Farms has demonstrated that apologetic information can actually go the other way. So an attempt to give honest, clear information in a world in which, you know, sometimes the main driving force is a sentimental attempt to be apologetic. So,
back here.
I would just like to ask a quick question about the art part of it. I get what you're saying about, you know, the way the translation has been portrayed, and as you were just going through that, I was remembering what I had seen over decades, and it wasn't the hat. And you argue that it's old hat to the general authorities.
yeah.
But
And to scholars, for sure.
it didn't make it through the curriculum committee into correlation. And so I just want to observe that the fact that BYU students might, as well as general Orthodox Mormons, might have an issue here, it's not their fault. It's the fact that they believed everything, all the pictures and all the artwork that was approved, and so forth. And also the fact, I would think that when, in our normal speech, when we think about and talk about something being translated, how could Parsons translated Max Weber's, you know, the capitalism, you know, Protestantism, you know, and the spirit of capitalism. We have a mental image of translation, and that image is what has been kind of reflected in the church-approved artwork. And so no wonder that some Orthodox Mormons don't quite get it right off the bat. And so I really appreciate your making such a contribution.
Thank you. And if I could just jump in on that, I think you make I think that is the point. In the research I did, we analyzed, my research assistant and I, every single image that the church has produced and printed in the Ensign since its inception, since 1971. So we looked at the last 44 years of artwork in the Ensign. We found that they've done 55 images of the translation. Not one of those images shows the hat. As a matter of fact, and here's what's interesting even, we talk Urim and Thummim, but only one image in the last 44 years in the Ensign ever depicted the Urim and Thummim. Which is very, very interesting. And so, obviously it's my hope, and I'm the first to say that this isn't, I mean, I hope there's much, much better images that come out than mine. I'm such a great artist that I'm a university professor of religion. That's how good of an artist I am.
We were his second choice.
And as a matter of fact, when I interviewed with Kirk Richards and Walter Rain and other great artists that carry much more talent than I do, I actually asked them if they would be willing to try to put together some more imagery so that we can help more and more people become more familiarized with perhaps what the translation may have looked like.
What did they say?
They said they'd be more than willing to. Yeah, I know. I'll just speak for Kirk Richards real quick. He said, I would have a hard time trying to do one that was too realistic. He said, I would want to make his very, the best word I could use would be stylized and suggestive.
So that being said, this is being taught in many religious education classes now.
Yep.
Probably most of them.
And it'll be a part of the new foundations course that'll be taught in all institute classes. So, I mean, I think that there's more to it than just the idea that someone, you know, at curriculum doesn't know the story. I mean, in that sense. I mean, part of what's going on with the Joseph Smith papers is that new sources have been discovered. I mean, for instance, like the Palmyra Freeman. I mean, that source didn't exist before. And so expecting someone to draw a conclusion a historical conclusion without all of the evidence is really expecting too much. And I think that in part, one of the reasons why there was a hesitancy to more widely embrace the accounts of translation were, first, they weren't sources from Joseph Smith, right? So Joseph says, at most, through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated by the gift and power of God. And then, of course, very famously in the Orange Conference says, I'm not going to tell you about the particulars of the translation. So that, starting with Joseph, there's, well, if he's not saying how it's done, why should we? Second of all, the two most prominent sources for how it was done just so happen to be two of the most prominent antagonists to the Utah church, right? So you have Emma Smith and and David Whitmer. And so those two sources were questioned sources by essentially non-professional historians who, for a religious reason, saw them as questioned sources. I mean, with David Whitmer, it's very easy. I mean, David Whitmer, in his 1887 address to all believers, says things like, I knew that Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet the moment he tried to give people the high priesthood, because the high priesthood's obvious that was Joseph just bringing power to himself. And he says that, but when he founded his own church in the 1840s, the first thing he did was ordain everyone to the high priesthood. So you can see why someone who already hasn't heard of that idea before, it's only coming from an incredibly antagonistic and at times very incorrect source, why they would say, we'll stick to what we think happened or what Joseph said, or at least what they think Joseph said. Now there's a lot more sources that have come to light. And I think that and professional historical analysis of them as well.
So pointing back to this classroom experience, so Alex Baugh, he's been teaching this for 10 years, and he's been on the hot seat for 10 years.
Andy Hedges too.
Andy Hedges also, and primarily coming from a student perspective. The students are saying, well, I don't want to hear that, or I've never heard that, and a sincere reaction, but nonetheless a reaction. Well, recently, and I think partly from the Gospel Answers to Gospel Questions essay, and hopefully our work has had some effect on it too, but Alex had a completely different reaction in this last semester. A student listened to him describe the translation process and then did this very faithful depiction of Joseph with his head in the hat, and all you see is this light rushing forth, almost blowing his head back as he's gazing into the hat. And it's a gorgeous piece of art that a student listened and said, well, I'm going to turn that into something I can see in my own mind. And that certainly isn't a historical one, because but very interesting. And I think like let me just say this too, the point isn't to pull the rug out from underneath people. I think that's a pretty poor way to do history. But the point is to look back in an academic, professional way and try to chisel down to the most trustable expressions of what happened. And sometimes I think in this case it's going to be different than it was portrayed over 200 years of a theological understanding of it. So
he's had a hand for a while there.
Well, speaking about educating church members more about the translation process of the Book of Mormon, I'm curious if any of you, particularly Brother Sweat, or if any of you can tell us if there's any talk about these images appearing in church curriculum, the Ensign, Institute manuals, or if this information that you're newly publishing is going to appear in more popular outlets for church members, anything like that.
That's a great question.
It's all you, Tony.
I have sent this image and been in contact with a few people to let them know the image is available. If they want to use it, more than willing. Unfortunately, I do know that there will be an article coming out talking about imagery of the translation of the Book of Mormon upcoming in the Ensign. They're not going to use my image for it. They were kind enough to call me and tell me that they wanted me to know that they were putting out an article on that, but that they weren't going to use mine. And I 100% respect that.
Okay.
I was contacted. Now, once again, they're not going to use it, which just goes to show better artists need to create more images. I was contacted about perhaps using this painting for the new, basically the remodel they're doing to the church history museum, where they wanted to include some imagery, and they were interested in some imagery with Joseph using the hat. So I wouldn't be surprised, and this is my own personal opinion, I can't speak obviously for church curriculum, nor for the art department. As a matter of fact, I contacted them when I did my article, and was not able to, they weren't able to come on record on anything for it. And I won't go tangential into that. But my hope is, I think we're going to see, with work like Mike and Gerrit have done, with, and I know many other scholars have put this out, and like Mike showed in his, some of the apostles have mentioned it. But I think something happened with the LDS.org topics essay. There was something to that the average Latter-day Saint, the common Latter-day Saint, when you talk about methods of translation, mechanics of translation, and you can say, look, this is right here on the LDS.org on this topics essay. There's a, oh, okay. And I think we'll see this idea becoming more and more and more accepted, and my hope is that therefore it'll penetrate more into the imagery that will help people once again understand and maybe embrace more the historicity of the translation.
We better make this the last question. We're up against the hour here.
Were you able to determine what exactly Joseph Smith maintained that this Urim and Thummim was? And did he think that that was actual Urim and Thummim that's mentioned in the Hebrew Bible?
I would say he didn't think it was that at all. I mean, I think you're dealing with a religious a device, right? And what we can track is when they start using the term Urim and Thummim, right? There's a very clear transition. Anything that's written essentially before 1833 is not going to say Urim and Thummim. It's going to say, like Jonathan Hadley said, spectacles. It's going to say interpreters. It's going to say seer stones, but it's not going to say Urim and Thummim. That was a transition that occurs. And I think obviously they're choosing a biblical term for a reason. I mean, and very, the idea of light is something that's a part of
or to make it sound more prestigious.
At least to make it sound more discernible, in the sense that when you say seer stone, I mean what does that mean, right? Whereas if you give it this biblical term, then you're associating it with a religious relic, essentially.
Didn't W.W. Phelps say
teraphim?
Yeah.
He called it teraphim or Urim and Thummim. He actually provides two words.
So there's a couple of factors that have to be. So the first time you get it is in W.W. Phelps' 1833 newspaper article. So there's a couple of things that have happened. Joseph has spent 3 years translating the Bible from 1830 to 1833, the spring of 1833. And so you have that factor. So he has biblicized his language even more. In addition to that, you also have a stirring of E.D. Howe and Hurlbut's research. And so they, in particular, start the emphasis between money digging and Joseph Smith, seer stones and
except not seer stones, peepstone, yeah.
Peepstones and seer stones. And so he associates that with the word he uses, necromancy, when he associates seer stones. So he's actually totally misinterpreting the whole seer stone culture in the first place, which can actually have a Christian culture to it. It's not necromancy. He's totally misunderstood this. And so you have that association that's drawing in 1833 and 1834. And so how do you relabel a religious relic? Well, you don't call it a liahona. You biblicize it. And so the seer stone, the brown stone, is Urim and Thummim. The two spectacles, the Book of Mormon spectacles, is Urim and Thummim. Any seer stone, D&C 130, so by the end of Joseph's life, he says everybody will have a Urim and Thummim. In fact, the world will become a Urim and Thummim. And so you can see like a very natural transition, and to some extent a reaction to the way some people are then describing the seer stone, and what even Pomeroy Tucker calls The seer stone is the acorn of the Mormon oak. So they're actually saying the emergence of Mormonism comes from the seer stone. And the seer stone is a peep stone. And the peep stone is related to necromancy. So that's one narrative, and that's a negative anti-Mormon narrative from Mormonism Unveiled. On the other hand, you have a different narrative. The Book of Mormon describes it as religious relics where God speaks to his prophets. And the Bible speaks of another religious object called the Urim and Thummim. And so they paint the narrative in a positive way for people to believe it as a religious relic rather than a necromantic tool. And there are two very distinct narratives there, and some people buy into one and some buy into the other. But Joseph's reaction to that is very clear. Of course you call it a Urim and Thummim. It will naturalize it to a very Protestant world who believes in a Urim.
And if you're trying to take something biblical, I mean, it's the closest thing you could find biblical to describe his use of stones that are sacred. I mean, he can't use just the terminology interpreters. They had been using that, and that wasn't enough.
Hey, I know we could stay all night, and they've been great. Thank you so much. Really quickly.
So a book, this is 5 years in the process, and I don't know when, I can't guarantee when it's going to come out, but it certainly has a draft and is at the tail end of where it's going, is about restoration of the priesthood. So we attempt to broaden it, and like, for example, one of the conclusions we come to is the traditional Peter, James, and John narrative is not something that Joseph Smith emphasized, but in fact it was a product of succession crisis. And I think this is an important narrative to tell. Additionally, we broaden the restoration to include the chamber of Father Whitmer, in which Joseph is his only account of how the Melchizedek priesthood was restored. So in a sense, this is a broadening of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood and the restoration of priesthood. And it addresses a question I think Dan Vogel has done so good at exposing this weakness in his work, is the concept of we don't have Joseph teaching about this kind of restoration until 1835. And I think Dan is the only one who's honestly addressed that. And so our book, Dan of course comes from an atheist position. Ours comes from a believer's position. It's not apologetic, but it certainly addresses some of the hardest questions about the restoration of the priesthood that have been long unanswered and very simplistically put. So that's it.
Cool. Awesome. So some more great scholarship to come. Thank you for being here.